Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around, let's talk about mirrorless battery life. And specifically, I want to talk about the best way to kind of measure, the best metric we have for measuring mirrorless battery life. And it's not what you think. And I also want to talk about how to figure out how many batteries you're going to need when you're out shooting, as well as give you 7 tips for conserving battery life in the field. So let's start with the first one. And the metric that we're all using, or everyone's trying to use for mirrorless battery life, is actually the number of shots, right? But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I don't think that's the best way to do this. The problem is our camera just doesn't use that much electricity. It doesn't really drain the battery that much by transferring an image from your sensor over to your memory card. It's just not using that much power. And in fact, I brought the receipts to prove this to you. Take a look at this screenshot. If you notice, I have 5,050 shots, but what I really want you to see is how much battery charge I have left. 93%. How the heck did I get 5,000 shots with just 7% of my battery, right? That's insane. In fact, if you look at that and kind of run those numbers out, I could get tens of thousands of shots on a single battery based on what you're seeing there. All I did is I grabbed the camera, popped my 256 gig card in there, just fired away and filled the card up as fast as I could. And the reason I did it is to prove that the shots that you're taking aren't really taking that much of a toll on your battery. In this case, it was only 7%, and that's for 5,000 shots. So what the heck's draining your battery then, right? Well, with our mirrorless cameras, we have a whole bunch of stuff that's running all in the background all the time, and that we didn't really have to the same extent or at all with our DSLRs. For example, we have the CPU in there, which is arguably more powerful than the ones we had in our DSLRs. It's going to take more juice. We have an LCD or EVF that's always on if we're shooting, right? Those are running constantly and they do take a toll on your battery. We also have all the other camera internals and electronics and things like that that are going. We also have some drains coming from the lens itself, like VR and AF, although those are not super significant, they still do take a little bit of a toll. What's really killing our batteries here, though, I think, is the sensor itself, because the sensor is constantly scanning. You're constantly running that sensor anytime you're using a camera. You can't look through the EVF or on the LCD without that sensor scanning constantly, and it's really taking a toll on the battery life. So we have stuff going on with our mirrorless cameras we just didn't have with our DSLRs. So bottom line, I think the time is a better metric for measuring our battery life with mirrorless cameras than trying to do the number of shots, because you're never going to get that right. The thing is, if you go out and you have a very heavy shooting day, maybe you're doing birds in flight and they're just all over the place, you may get 5,000, 6,000 shots on a single charge. On the other hand, if you're out shooting, say, an animal that's in a hole, I have like a picture of a raccoon peeking out of a hole I'll put up here. If you were in that kind of situation, I had to wait for a long time for him, but I had to leave the camera on because he was only popping up and out really quick and then he was back down. So I had to be ready. However, that meant the camera was running the whole time. So maybe I go 2 hours and I get 5 shots. Okay, so in each case, maybe I drained the battery, but on one hand, I had 5,000, 6,000 shots because I was constantly shooting. But on the other hand, I only got 5 shots. And the common denominator isn't so much the number of shots anymore. It's how much time the camera's actually running and active. So I think that's kind of how we need to start thinking about it, which leads me to my next point. So how do we determine how many batteries, how much power we're going to need in the field, right? So for me, I think of terms in actual runtime. And I actually devised a little test here that I'll put the methodology up here. You can pause if you want to read this. But I use this test. I think it's a pretty good simulation of what actually happens outdoors. And the numbers I get from this test seem to jive pretty well with what I see in the field for actual runtime. So when I'm talking about actual runtime, I'm talking about actually using your camera, your eye to the viewfinder time, not the time when the camera's off and you're walking with it in your bag or it's slung over your shoulder on a tripod and it's shut off. Not those times, or when it's on standby and you're waiting for something to happen. What I'm talking about is your eyes to the EVF and you're shooting. That's your actual runtime. And that's what these numbers here I'm about to show you are going to reflect. But it's important to know these numbers. I'm not trying to say one camera is better than another here. That's not really the point. The point is it's valuable to know how long your camera runs when you're going to be out in the field. How much runtime are you going to have? How much viewfinder time are you going to have before it dies? Because I think that's an easier way to estimate just how many batteries you ought to have with you on a given outing. So for example, let's say I'm taking my Z8 out for a morning and I know I'm going to be out for 4 to 6 hours. So in that case, I know I'm not going to spend 4 to 6 hours with my eye to the viewfinder and the camera on. I'm going to have to find the wildlife, and there's a good chance I'm going to be shutting that camera on and off quite a bit. So I probably need at least 2 batteries. I'll have one charged in the camera, and I'll have another in my pocket. Now I might have a third someplace where I can get to it easily. It's always better to have more than not enough, but realistically, I'll probably just use one battery and I might get into a second one in that scenario because I know how I shoot. Now, you might shoot differently. You might be working with a subject where you know the camera's going to be on the entire time. Maybe you're at a nest and you're just going to have to monitor it and you're waiting for something to pop up or out or whatever, or something to fly in. You can't shut the camera off. So you're going to have to monitor that viewfinder the entire time. So yeah, you're going to have to kind of plan your batteries accordingly. Finally, let's talk about 8 different things you can do to your mirrorless camera that can help improve battery life. Some of these are going to be more significant than others though, for sure. But before we get into any of them, I want to emphasize that you should not do anything that compromises your experience with the camera. So if by doing one of these things it makes the experience with your camera less enjoyable, then don't do it. I think people get way too caught up on battery life and they're way too worried about changing a battery in the field. As a guy who used to shoot 36 exposure rolls of film, let me tell you, popping a battery in and out is nothing compared to rewinding film and waiting for that to finish rewinding when you're watching something amazing happening in front of you. It's not a big deal to change your battery. It takes about 4 seconds. And the truth is, 99% of the time, you're going to have the time if there's something serious going on. The biggest thing is to remember to have that battery in your pocket and ready to go. And that way, when you have a brief break in the action, when you see that last bar show up on your battery, just pop it out and put the new one in and just keep shooting. So with all that in mind, here are the tips. So the first 5 here are going to be relatively minor in their individual impact, but maybe if you can use a combination of them, you'll see a little bit more benefit. So the first one is viewfinder frame rate, not frames per second for your camera itself, but the frame rate that you're seeing in the viewfinder. Most are 60, some are 120, some are 240, and a lot of times you can actually set that value yourself. The higher that value is, the more energy it's going to take, the more it's going to drain your battery. So if you can set that down the next level or so, you can save some battery life. However, for me, that's a no-go because I want those faster frame rates because it makes for smoother panning. So again, you have to balance your camera experience with how much battery life you want to save. Now, another thing you can do is shut off your GPS. If you're somebody who's using GPS, you can shut that off, and that is definitely going to save you a little bit of battery life there. The next thing you can do is turn on airplane mode. Now, the benefit may vary by camera, but it should save you a little bit of juice there. Another thing you can do is actually darken your viewfinder or LCD a notch or two. A little bit dimmer viewfinder or LCD can save a little bit of energy there. Finally, rounding out the more minor things you could do is you can shut off VR. It doesn't really use that much energy. I've done tests and it's only about 5% of your overall battery life if it's on the entire time. So those are the 5 minor things you can do, but there's 3 big ones you can do. So the first one is setting your camera so the rear LCD is off when your eye isn't at the EVF. Most people have their camera set for automatic switch. So when you're looking through the viewfinder, then you take your eye away. Whatever you were looking at on the viewfinder pops onto the rear LCD when you're in shooting mode. Well, most cameras allow you to shut that off. For example, with my Nikon Z8 and Z9, I can go to prioritize viewfinder. I just press the little button on the side of the viewfinder housing there. And what that'll do is it'll shut off my rear LCD when I'm not in playback mode or looking at menus. So when I bring my eye away from the viewfinder, that LCD doesn't turn on and drain my battery. With Sony, I can do something similar. I can press the little display button until my LCD goes black, and then when I put my eye to the viewfinder, I still have my viewfinder feed. When I bring my eye back, the LCD does not come on. And in both of these cases, if you want to look at photos back there or look at the menus, it will activate that rear LCD. And by the way, just a quick tip, if you want to go into shooting mode with that, but you don't want to hit the display buttons again or whatever, you can just give those a little tug. As soon as those LCD panels come out from the camera a little bit, they'll turn back on and you'll be able to use them in shooting mode again. So just a little quick tip there for you. So that's the first thing I do. Another thing I would do is make sure my camera had a reasonable standby mode. Now, some people will actually turn standby mode off on their camera, so that's really going to drain your battery. I have mine set to about 5 minutes because I want it to shut off if I forget to turn the camera off, but I don't want it constantly shutting off when I'm trying to actively use the camera and I happen to have my eye away for a little bit too long. So my advice is to set that standby timer for whatever time that you think is going to be long enough that if you haven't looked at the viewfinder, you should have shut the camera off. That's kind of my guideline for it. And finally, my biggest tip here is just to shut the camera off when you're not using it. I see people leave the cameras on all the time, and honestly, when I was doing DSLRs, same way, I left mine on all the time. I very seldom shut it off when I was out shooting. I would turn it on in the morning and shut it off at night. However, with mirrorless cameras and all the power drains they have, you want to make sure if you're not using the camera, you shut it off. You should not have that camera on when you're hiking through the woods, for instance, or when you're setting it next to you in the car as you're driving along. It should only be on when you anticipate a shot is imminent. Otherwise, I keep mine off, and it has made a huge difference in my battery life. So there you have it. Hopefully this helps you with your mirrorless battery life management. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out my educational materials. I have a ton of books and video workshops at my site that are chock full of everything I know about photography and are full of tips and tricks just like what you're getting here in these videos. As always, I hope you'll subscribe and share this with your friends. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.